Good day, beautiful people, and welcome back to Life Treasures and Golden Moments. This is Natalie Silva. I hope everyone's doing well out there this week and enjoying their week and hopefully enjoying warmer weather. We finally made it to the month of March, and this weekend is daylight savings time, so I'm hoping along with that comes our warmer weather. We've had lots of icy, cold weather everywhere, and I think people are about ready for spring. They just have that look about them, so even the pets look that way. So I'm hoping before too long we can all have some better weather. Well, listen, today I want to share a story with you from one of my very favorite authors, Squire Rushnell. And I believe I have shared a story with you before from his book called When God Winks at You. And he talks about how God directly speaks to us through the power of coincidence. And I chose this story today, and it's called The Quest of the Haunting Photo, about a young man who fought in the Vietnam War, and what happened to him, and how his life changed. This is a great story. I think you're really going to enjoy it. Rich Luttrell stood before the wall in Washington, D.C., a black wall of granite in size with names of the service people who died in the Vietnam conflict. It's a somber place. War is not glorified at this memorial. Instead, visitors are moved to tears by the unlived lives and the living heartaches represented by the 58,000 names on that wall. Lips move silently, tears drop, an object is set down. A hat, a mess kit, a can of beer, a teddy bear, a baby's pacifier, a watch, a folded American flag. Others watch in silent compassion. Would it change things, coming here, leaving a bit of grief at the wall? Rich, a vet from the Midwest, hoped it would. As his hand slipped into his pocket to complete his mission, his mind flashed to a scene embedded in his memory 22 years earlier. The year was 1967. It was a suffocating day in Chu Lai, Vietnam. The stifling heat, still air was held captive under steam-smudged skies. Rich Luttrell had not yet seen the enemy. He hoped he wouldn't. He didn't want to fight anyone in those conditions. Picking his way over rotted stumps, tangled vines, and mud potholes on a jungle trail, an imposing question pressed against his mind. Who might be lurking behind those leaves, those trees, the vines, waiting to ambush him? That day was no different than any others. The heat, the mud, the fear, the exhaustion. Not until one flash of movement changed everything. Instinctively, Rich swung to face the movement, his rifle raised, every nerve ending standing at alert. Through his crosshairs, a youthful NVA soldier was pointing an AK-47 at his head. Momentarily, they were alone. No one else was visible. Standing in the jungle, guns aimed at each other, they could have been the last two men on Earth. It was the longest 1 second in Rich's life. Why didn't the man shoot? He had the element of surprise. For a hating second, their eyes locked. Somewhere inside, two souls seemed to seek compromise in an impossible situation. In the second that only oozed forward, Rich the soldier was called to follow orders. Bam! His gun exploded. Bam! The enemy's gun fired. Bam! Bam! Before he could think, Rich fired at two other NVAs who stepped from the brush. Suddenly, there was a heavy firefight. Other soldiers, friendly and unfriendly, were firing weapons. Moments after it began, it was over. The squad of North Vietnamese soldiers pulled back, disappearing into the brush. Rich had won the battle. The evidence was at his feet. 3 corpses. But the teenager from Illinois had lost something that day that he would never find again. He lost his innocence. Somehow he never made it to a school prom, but on that day, against his own wishes, he became a warrior. Someone approached the first dead man and pulled a wallet from his uniform. Rich caught sight of something fluttering onto the ground. He picked it up and looked at it. A photo. Rich looked down at the man for a long moment, looked back at the photo, and quietly slipped it into his own pocket. Something unstated had passed between them. Now, 40-year-old Rich Luttrell stood at the wall. Since that day in July, long ago, he had become a husband, a father of girls, and a loyal employee of the state government of Illinois. All in all, it had been a good life, except for the one grief that hovered over him, sometimes landed and stayed. He traveled to the wall in hopes that he could end the vigil he had kept, praying his grief would find closure. As his wife watched, he pulled two items from his pocket, a tiny tattered photograph and a letter he had handwritten the night before. No bigger than a postage stamp, the photo showed a handsome, unsmiling Vietnamese father in his late 20s, with a slight frown drawing his eyebrows together. He was wearing his green NVA uniform. Next to him was a beautiful girl, about 7 years old, with maliciously groomed braided pigtails. She was not smiling either. All those years, the photograph was as precious to Rich as photos of his own daughters. He had carried it in his wallet since the day he picked it up from the dead soldier. Sometimes his daughters would give him a new wallet for Christmas. With each new wallet, the old wallet's contents were removed. The photo brought out, gazed at, and then carefully placed in the new wallet. With each new wallet and each fresh examination of the photo came a crushing sadness. "There's a young girl who doesn't have a father, thanks to me," he had remarked to himself. "Why don't you just get rid of it?" his wife asked so many times over the years, sensing the depression that enveloped Rich as he mentally returned to that jungle in Shiloh. As time passed, the photo became far more than a memento. The dead man earned his respect, even his devotion, in a North sort of way. The child engendered a sacred trust. He didn't know why, what the trust was, or what he should do with it, but he just wasn't able to get rid of it. The soldier and his daughter deserved more. The photograph deserved more. It finally became clear to him what more appropriate place to lay down the photo and hopefully his guilt than at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The night before, Rich penned a personal message to the soldier whose life he had taken, to the father of the daughter he had orphaned. "Dear Sir, for 22 years I have carried your picture in my wallet. I was only 18 years old that day we faced one another on that trail in Shiloh, Vietnam. Why you did not take my life, I'll never know. You stared at me for so long, armed with your AK-47, and yet you did not fire. Forgive me for taking your life. I was just reacting just the way I was trained, to kill VC or gooks. Hell, you weren't even considered human. So many times over the years, I have stared at your picture of you with your daughter. I suspect each time my heart and guts would burn with the pain of the guilt. I have 2 daughters myself now. Today, I visit the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in D.C. I had wanted to come here for several years now to say goodbye to so many of my former comrades. I truly love many of them, as I'm sure you love many of your former comrades. As of today, we are no longer enemies. I perceive you as a brave soldier defending his homeland. Above all else, I can now respect the importance that life held for you. I suppose that is why I'm able to be here today. It's time for me to continue the life process and relieve my pain and guilt. As I leave here today, I leave your picture in this letter. Forgive me, sir. I shall try to live my life to the fullest, an opportunity that you and many others were denied. So until we chance to meet again in another time and place, rest in peace. Respectfully, Richard A. Luttrell, 101st Airborne Division. Rich stepped forward, stooped, and set the photograph and his letter against the wall. He remembered how it felt. It was a way to honor and respect him. It was like saying goodbye to a friend. At that moment, it was like I had just finished a firefight and dropped my rucksack and got to rest. That load I was carrying was gone. Rich walked away after paying respects to buddies whose names were etched there. The past was finally behind him. I felt free, I felt relieved, he said. The photo was about to live on, even out of Rich's hands, with a power of its own. Objects left at the wall are picked up twice a day by gloved National Park service rangers, tagged with a reference number, the date, and the location where it was left. Thousands of objects are retrieved each year and shipped to the National Park Service Museum Resource Center, MRCE, in Landover, Maryland, where more than 50,000 items will never see the light of day. Just one of a score of objects picked up that day. Rich's photo and letter were recorded and laid in a box, a godwink that landed at the top of the box, face up. Dury Felton, Jr. learned the suffering of Vietnam firsthand. He had not seen the green NVA uniform in 30 years, nor had he wanted to. His time in Vietnam was the worst that life could ever deliver. It was locked away in some part of his mind. He wouldn't speak about it. As curator of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Collection, he felt he was chosen by Providence for the sacred job of caretaking the memories of 9 million Vietnam-era veterans. He considered himself a conduit to their history. He counseled his employees, Vietnam veterans all, to try to maintain an emotional distance from the objects that they handled. If you were to read all this and take it inside yourself, you would lose your mind. One guy's combat diary, I had to walk out of the door that day, said Dury, shaking his head sadly. Staring up at him from the top of a box of artifacts was the most unsettling of images. The small photo of a NVA soldier and a girl. In several years on the job, this was the first time anyone had ever left a photo of an enemy soldier. He felt a choking nausea as he looked at it, but as he read Rich's letter, his tension eased. He felt a release. Someone had put down on paper the swirl of anguished emotions about Vietnam's legacy that were the same as his. Dury respectfully lifted the photo and letter from the box. In the coming months, in talks and exhibits about the wall, he used the letter and the photo to help people understand the lingering effects of war on its soldiers. And now, the lingering effects of the photo were passed from Rich Luttrell to a new bearer. It haunted me for years and years as to who the little girl was, Dury said. In the early 1990s, Turner Publishing asked Dury to help create a book about artifacts left at the Vietnam Memorial. Among Dury's first choices for inclusion in the book, Offerings at the Wall, released in 1995, were the photo and a letter. Rich Luttrell knew none of this. In the 6 years since, Rich had left the photo at the wall. His life had been blessed. He had 2 daughters and 2 small granddaughters to love. One morning in 1996, his peace was shattered when Ron Stevens, an Illinois state congressman and a decorated veteran of Vietnam, burst into a meeting in Rich's office. Someone had given Ron a copy of Offerings at the Wall. Casually leafing through the pages, his jaw dropped. What he saw pulled him to his knees. He knew the photo. He knew who wrote the letter. His friend Rich Luttrell had once shared with him the story of his grief and how he had found solace by leaving the photo and a letter in Washington, D.C. "You got a minute?" Ron asked as he nodded to the others in the meeting. Rich's face clouded as he saw the title of the book. When Ron opened it to page 53, Rich stared and he wept. "Little girl, what do you want from me?" he choked. From that moment, Rich's life turned to nightmarish. His obsession returned stronger than before. Now he knew what he had to do. But first he had to get the picture back. He tracked down Dury at Vietnam Veterans Memorial Collection and asked the photo be returned to him. Although it was contrary to policy to return artifacts left at the wall, Dury made an exception. The photo had a life force that could not be denied. He flew to Illinois to personally deliver it to Rich. With the photo back in hand, Rich's quest began. The photo cycled through many lives and came back to him for a reason. 22 years in his wallet, 4 or 5 years working its way through the heart of another vet, finding its way into a book, and now back into his hands. He had succeeded in releasing his guilt, but now he felt an unfulfilled obligation to find the little girl, to give her the picture of her father, and to tell her that her father died nobly, with concern for an enemy soldier. That little girl won't leave me alone. If that's the way she wants it, I guess I'm just going to have to find her, vowed Rich. He began by contacting a newspaper reporter in St. Louis. When the story of his quest was in print, he folded up the paper and dispatched it to the Vietnamese ambassador in Washington, D.C., asking him for his help in finding the little girl. The ambassador sent the story on to someone he knew in Hanoi, knowing it would be a tall order, literally a needle in a haystack. With 80 million people in Vietnam, many of whom were beyond the reach of the media, finding the child in the photo would be a miracle. She would be in her late 40s if she were even alive. What were the chances anyone would recognize her, or a man who'd been dead for 30 years? In Hanoi, a local newspaper reporter, fascinated by the photo and letter, published it under the heading, "Does anyone know these people?" Not surprisingly, in a city of 3 million, no one did. Nor was Rich surprised. "I didn't really expect anything to come out of it," he said, "but it was something I had to do, to give it a shot." Again he felt some peace. After all, he had done everything he could. The Bible counsels, having done all, stand. Yet often at the very moment a person has done everything he can, and he truly stands, turning the matter over to the Almighty, that's when God will wink. A woman in a rural Vietnamese village opened a package from her son in Hanoi. Her gift was cushioned in crumpled newspaper. As she began to discard the old newspaper wrappings, she suddenly stopped, dumbfounded. Her eyes gazed upon something too precious for words. The image of her dead brother and his child. This Godwink was a gift far more precious to her than even the care package from her beloved son. "Does anyone know these people?" asked the newspaper. In a country of 80 million, one person did. She got up and began walking. Her dead brother's daughter lived down the road. In Springfield, Illinois, Rich Luttrell walked to his mailbox. It was the translation he'd been waiting for, a strange letter that had arrived earlier, handwritten in Vietnamese. Tremulously holding the translated letter, what possible hurt, anger, or sadness, or all three, might it contain? He was awash with emotions. The letter was from the girl in the picture. Now a grown-up woman named Lon, she wrote in almost childlike sweetness, "Dear Mr. Richard, the child that you had taken care of through this picture for over 30 years, she becomes adult now, and she has spent so much sufferance in her childhood by the missing of her father. I hope you will bring the joy and happiness to my family." Rich shook his head in disbelief. He reread the words, "I hope you will bring the joy and happiness to my family." She was offering a gift of her forgiveness. She wanted to see him. But now, how could he go back to Vietnam and face a woman whom he had left fatherless? Rich had no regrets over his actions as a soldier, but the effects of those actions seemed to be almost unforgivable even to him. Why go back and reopen old wounds? Rich and Lon traded letters and photos over the next several months. She invited him to turn his grief and haunting into joy and happiness. He was astounded at her generous spirit. "This whole thing's bigger than I am. It's hard for me to understand, but I know this is the right thing to do," he said to himself. He began his journey back to Vietnam. 8,000 miles later, in a distant Vietnamese village, Rich began walking toward a house behind a brick wall. Lon and her family were gathered in the courtyard on the other side, waiting for him. She stood slightly apart from the rest. Lon was unsmiling, giving no clue to her emotions. He walked to her, handed her a bouquet of flowers he'd brought with him, and in carefully practiced Vietnamese said, "Today I return the photo of you and your father, which I have kept for 33 years. He paused and swallowed. "Please forgive me." With that, he relinquished the photo into Lon's hands and ended a chapter that had begun in fear and violence 3 decades before. Lon pressed her father's image to her forehead and collapsed sobbing into Rich's arms. The photo was between them, just as it always had been. It was now a bridge to peace. After a torrent of tears, the two emerged from their embrace. Lan stared at the photo. She told Rich it was the only picture she had of her father. Rich told Lan and her family, who were hungry for information about Lan's father. "Your father died a brave and courageous warrior." Hugging Rich again, Lan said she believed he brought her father's spirit home to her family, her brother and her. They believed that their father lived on in Rich, and they forgave Rich. Rich Luttrell had a quest much bigger than most of ours. It has impossible odds of success. He learned that as you and I need to remind ourselves that with God there are no odds, nothing is impossible. Still, it's incredible how he worked so many God winks into Rich's story. How in the act of war, a symbol of life, a tiny personal photograph fell from a dead man's wallet. How the photo seemed to possess Rich for 22 years until he left it among hundreds of artifacts at the wall in D.C. How the photograph in Rich's personal letter ended up on the top of the box of artifacts and moved the spirit of another veteran, who in turn used the photo and letter to teach others about the toll of war, in his lectures and in his book. Finally, the extraordinary Godwink, that photo was published, and that it would end up in the Hanoi newspaper crumpled in a care package to a remote village in Vietnam, to be opened by the aunt of the girl who was sought by Rich Luttrell 8,000 miles away. This chain of Godwins that showered peace and forgiveness on two families on opposite sides of the globe is a remarkable tribute to God's power in each of our lives and how He places signposts of reassurance along the paths of each of our quests. Often as you're on your journey toward your quest, you visualize the fine line in your mind's eye. You can see yourself enjoying the prize that had been the object of the desires of your heart. Still, you remain unclear as to exactly how you're going to get there. A mountain climber visualizes reaching the summit and has a plan to get there. He knows that many adjustments along the way will need to be made to correct his course. Moreover, the climber knows that if he sits at the bottom waiting for the summit to come to him, it never will. He must get started, heading in the direction he believes to be the correct one toehold at a time. Each of these beautiful stories that Squire Rushnell has shared, they all had desired places in their hearts. Not until they put their hands on their steering wheels of their lives and struck out toward their purpose did extraordinary Godwins begin to unfold. That is what will happen to you, and the closer you get to your summit, the clearer it will be. Thank you for listening today. I hope you enjoyed this story and it touched your hearts and gives you a better understanding of what our veterans go through. And we need to give them more support and show our appreciation to them. I wish you all a beautiful week, a beautiful month. And you all take care. And until next time, may God bless. This is Natalie Silva.